burned down again, right?
Yeah, they had a second fire.
So it's gone totally.
They've just demolished it and they're going to do something new. So they're
Oh my
currently looking at
God.
designs for something
Do you mean they're
new.
not going to just rebuild it?
No, they've said it's beyond repair.
That's
That's
an
sad.
actual tragedy.
So I know that building very well.
Oh, well, you were lucky at least to experience it.
Okay. I'll keep admitting, but it's really coming now. Okay, they will have to wait then. I'm going to. Okay. Just a quick note before we start. Can you please turn off cameras and mics for the sake of broadband? Okay, good evening, GMT time-siders and neighbors, and good morning, California. Thank you all for zooming in for another smashing ArchiZoom lecture. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce my mentor and fellow lover of railroads, Professor Chip Sullivan. I would like to start my introduction by citing Chip's own words, and I quote, "I love to draw. I love to draw almost more than anything else in the world. It brings me solace, excitement, and the thrill of experimentation. When I'm feeling low, drawing can make me happy. With a single sheet of paper and a mark-making tool, I can create whole new worlds. When I'm immersed in the creative process, I love to work hard, but when the work is done, it's time to relax with a Guinness, a cigar, and a game of billiards. When I'm not drawing or shooting pool, I'm a work on my Lionel model railroad empire or learning to drive a steam locomotive." Chip Sullivan is professor of landscape architecture at the University of California at Berkeley. He received his MA in urban and regional planning and his BA in landscape architecture from the University of Florida at Gainesville. He is a landscape architect and artist who maintains a lifelong commitment and devotion to promoting landscape architecture as an art form. Chip has expounded on the meaning of perception of landscape through innovative forms of pedagogy, representational techniques, and writing. The philosophy and application of sustainable design through art and ecology has been a constant topic lecture throughout Asia, Europe, and North America. His graphic work illustrating the balance between humans and nature has been exhibited in galleries across the globe. Chip's site-specific environmental installations incorporate articles, devices such as the Claude Mirror, spectroscope, and camera obscura to heighten the observer's perception and insight of landscape. Professor Sullivan counts numerous accolades and awards. Amongst them, he was the 1984-85 Fellow in Landscape Architecture at the American Academy in Rome, and in 2016, the American Society of Landscape Architects, ASLA, announced Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning Chip Sullivan as the 2016 recipient of the George D. Carpenter Teaching Medal for significant and sustained excellence in landscape architecture education. Selected by ASLA's Board of Trustees, the honor represents the highest award ASLA presents each year. In his nearly 3 decades career at the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley, Professor Sullivan has inspired thousands of students with his informative and comical illustrations, exceptional instruction methods, and his belief in the power of landscape architecture to create positivity and change in the world. Perhaps best known for his distinguished graphic ability, he has authored many books, most notably as the author of Drawing the Landscape, a popular treatise on drawing and the creative process, which is now in its 4th edition. Further successful publications include The Impulse to Draw, Empowering Imagination for the Electronic Age, which is a manifesto on creativity, imagination, and drawing, and was co-authored with Joe Slutsky. Illustrated History of the Landscape Design was co-authored with Elizabeth Bowles, uses storyboards, visual narratives, and the illustrative timelines to illuminate the history of landscape architecture. Most recently, Chip's book, Cartooning the Landscape, a 2016 University of Virginia Press publication, won the John Brinkenhoff Jackson Prize Foundation for Landscape Studies. In addition to numerous awards and fellowships, Chip was also the subject of a documentary titled The Professor, part of a series of films on creativity by Emmy Award-winning director Alan Holzman. Professor Sullivan has also been a long-time supporter of students' projects and initiatives, dedicating his career to his students' personal and professional development. His influence on his students is apparent in the way they praise his creativity and unique approach to problem solving and thinking outside the box. Tonight, Chip will delight us with one of his inspiring lectures, this one under the provocative title, Do Electronic Trees Dream of Photosynthesis? Spirits of Place, Art, Nature, and Consciousness. In this talk, Chip Sullivan's ecological narrative charts a map to a world of wonder, imagination, and mystery. For decades, Chip has expounded on the meaning and perception of landscape thought, his innovative pedagogy, representational techniques, and writing. In this presentation, Chip will share with the audience tools to help them envision a metaphysical partnership with the landscape and activate the power of the genius loci to create positive environmental change and innovative placemaking. I would like to end my introduction with one more quote. Chip says, "Design is magic, teaching is my passion, and the creative journey is our destination." Please join me in welcoming the grand cartoonist, Professor Sullivan.
Holy cow. Thanks, B. I mean, that's true.
So you.
I'm just so excited to be here. I mean, the miracle of Zoom, all the way in California, and I'm in London and England. It's pretty amazing. But first off, I would like to thank Birmingham University and Beatrice for organizing this fantastic lecture series and putting together like the most amazing graphics to kind of like promote these lectures. I mean, this is pretty emotional for me to be here because B was one of my best kind of teaching assistants. And kind of one of the great rewards of teaching is when the people that you teach go out and begin to teach. And it's just so wonderful when your former students carry the torch onwards, you know, like, and I'm showing pictures of her in Edinburgh when she came all the way up from London to celebrate my opening of my drawings. And then the bottom image is what I wish we could all be doing after this lecture, is going to a pub and drinking a Guinness. So that's really terrific. And then also, even more amazing, is another former teaching assistant who is also teaching at Birmingham University, and this is Mark Kelly. Mark Kelly was also a teaching assistant at Berkeley. And also, even more amazing, he was a Rome Fellow at the British School in Rome. And he invited Elizabeth and myself to be visiting scholars. It was one of the best 2 weeks we ever had. And even more amazing, one of our former students was also in Rome at the same time on another fellowship. And there's the three of us with James, the two of us with James, drawing in the landscape. So in summary, you know, like the great thing about us is we all like promote this idea, the passion of teaching and the passion of drawing. So again, thank you. And just so the irony and the beauty of all this is just really, really fantastic. So the title of my lecture, as you already know, is Do Electronic Trees Dream of Photosynthesis? And I'll get into that in a moment, why I chose that title. But one of the kind of focus of my lecture tonight is this idea of the earth mysteries, because throughout history, landscapes have evoked this powerful kind of response in us. And what is it exactly? You know, like, how do we mark the landscape? And it's even more interesting that we don't even know why these mysterious landscapes were created, why these markings were there. I first started to begin to think about this when I was trying to teach topographical design, and I was thinking about, well, the Earth is a living body, and the human body is also alive. And I was trying to make these comparisons on how we mark the Earth and how we mark the human body, and how the, the Earth is sacred and our bodies are sacred. And what kind of marks do we choose to put on our bodies, and what kind of marks do we choose to put on the landscape? Both are permanent, like sometimes they're beautiful, sometimes they're horrible, but the Mother Earth is alive, like we're piercing the earth and engraving into the earth's surface. So that became sort of my journey of kind of thinking about kind of the marks on the landscape. Now, one of the things that kind of, I guess, tipped the scales or promoted my idea of beginning to rethink this idea of the genus loci is I was asked to write a blurb for this book that came out about a conference called Coding Design, Designing Code, about this whole idea of the electronical landscape, about like coding the landscape, analyzing landscapes. And in some sense, I was honored, and I wrote them back and I said, like, do you know who I am? Like, this is so far removed from my kind of like my focus. And they said, oh, no, we want you to kind of like write this introduction. And in fact, Can a Landscape Be Coded? On the right-hand side, you see a garden by Topher Delaney, where she actually created this code in the background. But one of the things I began to think about is, and this terrified me because it seemed that we were moving ourselves further and further away from the sense of place in the genus loci. This sort of like, I'm not a Luddite. I think these tools are really great, but the unfortunate thing or the scary thing to me is that we're moving ourselves further and further away from what the basis of landscape architecture is, which is the spirit of the place, the genus loci. And I further kind of promote this idea by thinking, like, if you've all been alone in the woods by yourself, and you've all felt something. And my question is, what is that something? What is that strange presence that you feel, that kind of like something you can't define, something you can't kind of photograph? What is it? And if you look at the image on the lower left, what does the child see? What does the child see that the adult doesn't? What happens when we start to look at something, like when do we lose that ability of wonder to look at the landscape? So I think that's a really important thing to think about. Like, what is the genus loci? What is the spirit of the place? Liz and I visited the famous Fairy Glen in the Isle of Skye in Scotland. And the great thing about England is that it's kind of almost the homeland of the idea of the spirit of place and the kind of mysterious landscape. Alexander Pope, one of the first things I learned in landscape architecture was the genus loci. The very first thing you need to consult when you're doing a design is, what is the spirit of the place? What is the genus what is the genius? And that's something that scared me when I was reading this book on coding the landscape. Is kind of like we're moving further and further away from that. And I think it's time to think about how can we reintegrate that into our designs. And I think it's important to perhaps the degradation of the landscape that's happened is because we no longer personify the landscape. In Greek and Roman mythology, the gods and goddesses all had strong ties to nature and plant life. Each deity was symbolized with a plant or a flower. In ancient Greek, ecosystems were associated with unique deities, so they were identified with these sort of human personifications. And in Roman mythology, the genus loci was essentially the protective spirit of a place, an outward revelation of an inner spirit of the location. So the spirit of the place can reveal itself in many different ways: sensation, atmosphere, unique flora, fauna, or even geological formation. So this is something that gives the landscape its special magic. The spirit of place is a magical power that resides in the landscape. I mean, how many of you feel that? Why do we go to certain places in the landscape to be stunned and moved by the beauty of nature? What is that? It's defined by its location. That feeling can't be transformed to another place. So it's very important to understand that local thing. Each landscape is individual. Each landscape has a spirit of personification. And I think if we go back to that, we would kind of like maybe treat our landscapes better if we actually thought of them as human personifications. And throughout history, these places, the spirit of place was always marked by special kind of shrines or special kind of locations. I mean, we can look at the Falls of Tivoli that painters over time have painted over and over again because it evokes the sacred space, the sacred feeling. Diana's Sacred Grove in Nemi, the temple in Lake Nemi, so like these odd shrines that are located in the landscape. The Romans would always indicate when they understood the spirit of the place, that spirit of the place would be indicated with a shrine. And this sort of came to the front of Liz and I when we went to Umbria and we stayed in the mountains of Gubbio. And we're both very kind of superstitious. And we were staying in an abandoned, well, like a kind of agriturismo in a kind of like an old abbey. And every night, like in the middle of the night, I would wake up and see these flashing lights. And, I didn't want to tell Liz about it because we're both, it would scare both of us. But when we were leaving and I described this to her, she looked at me and stunned and went, I was seeing the same exact flashing lights. On the way out, we were driving out and we saw this shrine that was right outside our window where we were seeing these flashing lights. That was a shrine to this vision that someone had there. And then doing a little bit of history later, we found that St. Francis stayed here many times. But the overriding thing that was here, this was a temple of the Roman genius. This was the genus loci, that on the site was a temple to the genius. And it's kind of like how it's been transformed over time. So that was kind of our first experience where we really experienced this sort of kind of like mysterious power that the landscape has. So another question that I have as I began to look at the spirit of place and kind of try to adapt it to the design process, where have all the mythological gods gone that were venerated for thousands of years? Where have all these gods and goddesses gone that we worshiped as spirits of place? Well, I think they're still here. I think they're here, but they haven't been venerated or they haven't been brought back alive. But have they? I want you to think about that. Because when I first started to teach this class in sacred landscapes, I wanted to use images from film that were using sacred groves or woodlands. And I was never, I never read The Hunger Games or followed The Hunger Games. So when I started to look it up and even watch the movies to find these images of forest, I started to see that Jennifer Lawrence was with a bow and arrow and hunting in the woods. And then it's not dawned on me. And I want you to think about this. Who is she really in The Hunger Games? Who is this ancient goddess that's come back to us in films? Who is she? I mean, there's something wired in our DNA that these ancient gods and goddesses keep reappearing. She's Artemis and Diana the huntress. And when the Hunger Games opens up, she's in the woods and about ready to shoot a deer, which she's the protector of, and she decides not to. And this made me think about, well, like these goddesses are still here. These personifications of nature still exist within us. They're so wired into our DNA that they're a part of us. And a part of it is how do we make that come alive? One of the things I find most powerful or like most interesting as a landscape architect and someone trying to understand the spirit of the place is the oracle, the Delphi oracle. And what I think is unique about this is the priestess would sit over this crack in the earth and breathe the fumes of the earth and have these divinations and give these oracles. And what I think is important about this is the priestess is reading the fumes of the earth. She's investing that and it's coming out. And we kind of need to get back in touch with that ability to connect with the Mother Earth and read those fumes. And for years, I visited, Liz and I took tours to Italy, and almost every Italian garden had an nymphaeum. And what is it? Finally, when I was starting to study water, what is a nymphaeum? A nymphaeum is a theater of the nymphs, the water nymphs. Who are water nymphs? Water nymphs read the oracles of water. One of the very first oracles we had as humans was reading the waters. These oracles are designed to kind of bring us to read the water, to make the water come alive. And the water chain at the Villolante, which when I was in school studying this, I thought this is the weirdest looking thing in the world, especially for a formal Italian garden that's orthogonal and Cartesian logic. But I realized when I walked down this, it makes you stop because of the angles. You have to stop and go slow and look at the water, and the way the water is motivated, it's gurgling and burgling. It's speaking to us. It's telling us prophecy. It's giving us prophecy. The very first forms of prophecy, the very first forms of churches and religious sanctuaries were oak trees, where the practice of prophecy of reading the sound of the wind through the trees was the very, very, very first form of divination, which I think is wonderful. How many of you have been alone in the woods and listened to the wind whistling through the leaves? What is it telling us? What is it saying us? And you know, the kind of like the importance of the tree of knowledge, you know, like almost every religion has a tree of knowledge. And now I begin to get into this idea of the vocabulary of landscape. Our vocabulary comes from sacredness. Everything in the lands, every element we use has a sacred origin. For instance, you know, the tree of knowledge, forbidden tree of knowledge actually comes from the Egyptians, where they would actually kind of dissolve the fruits of that tree, and it was one of the most powerful hallucinogenic plants on the earth. So maybe the forbidden tree, the forbidden fruit, is this ability to unlock our subconscious, unlock that world. You know, the African tree of life, the baobab tree, is also a sacred tree that also provides some sort of like fruit that allows you to see divination. And of course, Avatar. You know, what is the most important focal point? Avatar. It's the sacred tree. So, I mean, these things are so embedded in our subconscious, they do not go away. The tree of knowledge. Where did Buddha gain enlightenment? You know, and this is what's wonderful about our profession. We plant trees. We're planting trees or vegetation and plant life that provides us with enlightenment. How cool is that? And the other thing to think about is the goddesses of agriculture. Think about agriculture. The moving, you know, like the creation of agriculture was created, you know, like this sacred thing, the sacred transformation of the earth with seeds and the growth of things. But there's also this element of the transformation of plant life into an elixir, a magic elixir. So I began to think about this when I'm driving around town or driving around the world, and I see like liquor stores always advertise spirits. What is that? You go to the liquor store and you buy the spirit. What is the spirit? As we know, alcohol comes from the distillation of a plant's essence. So in fact, when you're drinking alcohol or even beer, you're drinking the essence of that plant. You're drinking the landscape. And you know, this is no excuse to go out and get drunk, but maybe it is. But the next time you have some gin, think about where that comes from. Like all of these elixirs, all of these transformational things that we drink come from plant life. And I think that's really fascinating. And they all were represented throughout history, you know, as the goddess, you know, the Demeter was the goddess of grain. These various goddesses represented that. Now, one of the things Liz and I did one summer is we wanted to study the gardens of Lenotre in France. And of course, we went to the forest. We went to Fontainebleau to see Lenotre's garden at Fontainebleau. I'm looking at the map and I'm going, wait a minute, you know, Barbizon is here. You know, the Barbizon School of Painting. We went to see Lenotre's gardens, but all of a sudden we realized that, oh my God, let's go see Barbizon. Fontainebleau is the fountain of the goddess of Diana, that it was the blue fountain, had this sacred quality to it. So what happened when we got to Barbizon? And it was really, really hot in the summer. And we stopped at this wonderful little bar and ordered a beer. And as you know, talk about this transformational quality of the distillation of spirits. As I bend over to drink my beer on this hot day, I paused and I looked down the street and I had an epiphany. I understood what the gardens of Fontainebleau were all about. As I sat there in this bar, looking down the street that met dead end to the woods where the painters, the Barbizon School of Painters for hundreds of years would go into this forest to be inspired by the woods. So you have this, the border of reality, the tonal and the nagual, the border where you take that leap of faith and you go into the unknown, the creative subconscious. So you have the rational world on one side, divided by making this kind of like leap of faith to go into the unknown and be inspired by the woods. And that's when it hit me. That's when I kind of began to understand the power of nature to inspire us. How many of you have knocked on wood for good luck? Where does that come from? Everybody's knocking on wood. I see it almost daily. Well, it comes from when you would go into the woods, when you would go into the enchanted woods, the enchanted grove, or any unknown woods, you would knock on a tree to wake up the tree dyads. That the triad for good luck, that they might grant you a safe journey through their domain. So this is where knocking on wood comes from. And we don't even know it. We don't even understand it. And another big revelation I had, because I am a film buff, is that you'll find this over and over again, you know, throughout film. The truth is always revealed in the woods. This goes back to Shakespeare. It probably goes back to the Greeks. It probably goes back to the beginning of time with the sacred grove, where the sacred grove was also one of our first churches. But you'll see throughout film history that almost truth is always revealed in the woods. And that's something wonderful we do as landscape architects. We plant groves of trees. How cool is that? And then it's just a little bit of film history. You begin to look at the enchanted film, the enchanted forest in contemporary film. Totoro, the sacred tree. Pan's Labyrinth, the sacred grove, the sacred tree in Avatar. And it just, you know, it just goes on and on and on. Once you begin to see that, you can maybe see that these things are still part of us, and we need to make them visible. We need to become more aware of them. Another interesting thing, epiphany that I had when putting together my class in sacred landscapes, I started to notice, why is it at the worst, the ugliest, monotonous shopping malls throughout the world, they always have a fountain in the center. Why are those fountains full of pennies? Why do we throw money in water for good luck? Where does that come from? Do we even know? Again, this is another thing that's hardwired into our DNA. And where does it come from? Well, it comes from the wishing well. What is the wishing well? Why do we put money in the wishing well and make a wish? This is a conduit to Mother Earth. This is a conduit to the Gaia spirit. This is our connection to the unknown. And this goes back to the beginnings of time. I talked about how the first oracles were in the divination of the sound of wind through trees. Well, also the pools of sacred fountains were also a form of divination, where you would make an offering, and hopefully the goddess of that fountain will make your wish come true. And you can find this throughout Ireland. Every Catholic church is next to a sacred fountain. And then you look at this idea of healing water. Our Lady of Lourdes, people from around the world come here for the power of water to heal one. You know, isn't that magnificent? What do we do as landscape architects? We put fountains in our landscape. So this is a sacred act, the creation of water, which is kind of like the origins of life. Water, and you look at sacred water, you know, globally, almost every culture has some sort of rite of passage with water, with baptism or purification before you go into a temple, or the Hindus having to make a journey once in their life to the sacred river. You know, in Ireland, the sacred fountains. This is really an important fact, that water, you know, is really, really important. And this kind of came true for us when Liz and I visited Brittany 2 summers ago, and we went into the Pampont forest, and we wanted to see these forests because they, you know, had been written about. We parked our car, and a busload of kids got off, and we're starting to like move into the pathway to get to the woods. So we quickly went the opposite way around and came around. The clouds was getting dark and darker and darker. So we approached this famous fountain that we wanted to see, and we looked into the fountain and went to grab some. Apparently the water has some purification qualities to it. I splashed some water on my face, and it splashed onto this rock on the left-hand side. Suddenly the sky got dark and the lightning cracked and it started to rain. And so like we got out of there, but on the way out, we read this sign that we didn't see because we came in the backwards, that this fountain has the history that if you splash water on the flat rock to the left of the fountain, thunder and lightning will appear, and you will have your wishes kind of granted. That it activates, this process activates the spirits of the woods, which are personified in these sort of like lightning strikes. Now there's another thing that happens, those of you who've grown up kind of reading children's stories and fables and things along that side. Why is there always a troll under the bridge? Why does a troll hide under the bridge? And then what does a bridge represent? And another thing as landscape architects, we're always making bridges. You know, this is another one of our vocabulary elements. It's really, really important. Why do you have to make an offering to the troll under the bridge? Because the bridge connects the known with the unknown. It's more of a physical manifestation of like the forest of Fontainebleau, that may God grant you the wish that you will get across. You will make this bridge into the unknown. The bridge of Tabitha, you know, is this idea like this connects reality with the unknown, that you're making this journey across the bridge. You're bridging the gap. You're moving across. And I like this in Seattle, Washington, they actually put a troll under the bridge. So bridges become really, really important. They're actually a portal. And how many of you saw Midnight in Paris? One of my favorite films. Even though Woody Allen is not the greatest guy in the world, I think this film's a breakthrough. There's something too about midnight. What happens when the clock strikes 12? This is always the portal into another dimension. But really, because I like to work late at night, it's really not 12 o'clock, it's 11 o'clock. If you'll notice, if you're working late at 11 o'clock, all of a sudden, the sound goes down. Everything gets eerily quiet. And I've been noticing, because we've been stuck inside, I've got 2 10-pound weights, I'm exercising, we have these motion sensor lights outside. 11 o'clock is when the nocturnal animals come out. You know, they're setting off these kind of motion detector lights. So there's this kind of magic portal that happens. And also, you know, when I lived in the East Coast, I kind of missed the thunderstorms, but there's something about the creative effects of negative ionization. You know, it's not positive ionization. Somehow before a thunderstorm, a lightning storm, the air gets charged with negative ions, and this is supposedly one of the most creative times of life. And perhaps this is why we're kind of fascinated with the edge of the ocean. When you go to the edge of the ocean, that ionization's happening with the waves coming on the land. Maybe that's also why we're connected to fountains, because fountains kind of ionize the water and move it up and move it around. Now, I was in England. I mean, England is the greatest place to study sacred landscapes. I don't know why this island has all of these great things, but there's also something called lines of sight that Alfred Watkins, a photographer who after World War I got a camera, and thank goodness it was a black and white camera, because he was fascinated with the landscape. And he'd go out and take these black and white photographs and come back into the studio and develop them. And he began to notice things that he wouldn't see with the human eye in color. He started to notice these lines on the landscape. He called them lines of sight. And in The View Over Atlantis by Jean Michel, he talks about ley lines. And you know, like England is crossed with these ley lines. And the most important one, I think, is St. Michael's alignment that connects all of these kind of like Catholic shrines for St. Michael, the angel. But these are really go back to pagan times, that these kind of alignments, and on his day of worship, the sun lines all of these things up. And the earth is crisscrossed with these kind of magic lines. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, being an Irishman, and kind of like our tradition of the wee people, which is kind of embarrassing to talk about. I didn't really, you know, like, we don't really tell people about this, but there's something intriguing about the fairy faith that I think is interesting. What is the fairy faith? You know, what is this element that enlivens the landscape, where the fairies supposedly danced at fairy rings, which are considered to be really magical places. The fairy rings, they say there's the walking down the primrose path, being led down the primrose path is a way to take you into the fairy world. There's certain landmarks in Ireland that actually glow, and there are also these landmarks that supposedly where the fairies lives. Well, people will hear eerie singing and eerie sound. And, you know, we also know the Covington fairies, you know, like these 2 young girls who supposedly saw fairies. They took pictures of them. It was turned out to be a hoax. But what are these fairies? Why does the myth of the fairy and elves kind of persist throughout? This image on the right is a recent photograph of fairies. And this is a real photograph taken by this English professor, John Hyatt, very recently, within the last few years, that people are still seeing these fairies and trying to record them. So what are they exactly? And when I gave a lecture in kind of like Iowa, and I was talking about the wee people, and afterwards someone came up to me very sheepishly and he said, you know, when I was visiting the medicine wheel, it was a sacred site, and my Indian guide, you can only visit it with an Indian guide. He was walking me around, and as we were going down from the mound where the medicine wheel was, he was showing me these little caves. He said, and this is where the wee people live. Then I realized even the American Indians believe in these kind of mysterious little people. And then I started to look at it globally. Almost every culture in the world has a belief in wee people. And I don't know where this comes from or what it means, but it's kind of interesting. It also is an opening too that I think like our beliefs, you know, like that all of these gods and goddesses that I've been focusing on have a global history. And then perhaps this global history of these gods and goddesses is maybe something can unite us, because every culture has almost similar goals and similar gods and goddesses. But as I begin to think about this, it's kind of ironic that there is a huge movement where people build these mini fairy gardens. The magazine and books actually have a greater circulation than Landscape Architecture Magazine and Landscape Journal. So there's this huge kind of underground movement where people are evoking or making these little shrines to the we people. Now, what are these really? So I begin to think about it. As we know, recently, science has begun to catch up with the fairy faith and the genus loci. We now know that plants communicate. We know that they can send messages. We know they communicate underground. So perhaps in Ireland, when we see the land, when people, the adepts can hear the landscape singing, or adepts can see the landscape blowing, or see where the fairies move through, perhaps these are the unseen elements of the landscape. We now know that mushrooms have this interconnection, that almost the whole underground earth is connected with this kind of intertwining of mushrooms. And perhaps what we're seeing when the adepts see this, they're seeing the chemical transformations of the landscape. These kind of hidden circuits and transformation of energy into one thing or another is perhaps what we're seeing in the landscape. And that made me think like, so maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's why there's this universal belief in the fairy faith. And these unseen currents in the landscape. You've all in school gotten two magnets and putting them with iron filings, and you see this magnetic thing. So the whole earth has this magnetic terrestrial magnetism, that this unseen forces of magnetism are flowing through the landscape. And what does that mean? And we look at these hidden forces, the ocean currents, the power of these unseen forces, the air currents, and the flyways. And we know that animals move through the landscape mysteriously when they migrate, and they're seeing things that we can't see. Birds and aerial birds can see these currents. We know that the wind current changes from layer to layer, that you put propellers up, they'll be moving at different distances, that the birds can actually read these things. Waterfowl can actually follow these currents. So there are these whole hidden currents in the landscape. And one of the things I like about geomancy and Feng Shui is that actually they created these devices where you can actually kind of read these hidden currents and study these hidden currents. And in the old days in China, you had a geomancer come in first, and they located the proper placement of buildings, which I think is really, really important. I've been trying to interpolate the Chinese writing on the geomancy wheel on the left with not much avail. I have not been able to find out why. I want to interpret that someday. And the whole idea of Feng Shui is really a climatic way of organizing things in the landscape. And we know through the use of Kirlian photographs that plants give off auras. So if you think about it, landscape is alive. It's giving off an aura. And I happened to have been down in Esalen once, I took a class down there, and they were actually giving a class how to plant plants next to each other according to their auras. So there's this whole unseen world that I think is really, really important. And as a fan of Japanese sand gardens, I like them. I don't understand them. I always thought they were the weirdest things in the world. But now, after I did this research, I realized exactly what's happening here. That the monks are actually raking these hidden currents, these hidden magnetic currents of the landscape. They're actually participating. The birds can fly along the magnetic currents. The sea creatures can float and swim along the magnetic currents. And this here, the monk, in the sacred garden, in a sacred consecrated space, they're participating in creating or following these hidden currents in the landscape. Now, the image on the left, you can almost see the vibrations that the different sacred rocks are planting. And we know in Feng Shui and the Qia that all things on the earth have a living spirit. Now, we look at this, I'm talking about individual elements in the landscape. Now, how do we link these up? Throughout history, there's been sacred pilgrimages. And one of the things that happened to Liz and I when we were leaving our stay in Gubbio, and we drove out after passing the shrine. We were driving down the small 2-lane road down the mountains. We turned the corner, and there, standing on the corner, was the Franciscan monk hitchhiking. Now, we don't pick up hitchhikers generally, but we looked at each other and went, "How can we not pick up this hitchhiking monk?" So we picked him up. He sat in the back seat. He and Liz were talking back and forth in Italian. We get down to the bottom of the hill, and He says, you can let me off at this gas station. And he said, but before you let me off, can I give you my blessing? And so, of course, yes, please give us your blessing. So we let him out, and he's standing there, and we're getting ready to leave. Liz and I look at each other and says, shouldn't we give him some money? We turn around to give him some money, and he disappeared. Now, this is one of the oldest stories about these. You've heard of these stories where, like, on the anniversary of someone's death on a highway, they're hitchhiking and they get picked up. So this is sort of like a participation in one of these universal stories of the pilgrimage, of moving from one place to another. And throughout history, the journey, the pilgrimage has been an important thing. And that's another important thing that we do as landscape architects, is we create pathways. We connect one thing to another. Those that can't take journeys use things like prayer beads, the rosary, as a way of recreating these journeys. So this has kind of been replaced with something I called celluloid tourism. This idea of the sacred journey being replaced with, as I said, these sort of hidden sacred elements that happen in films. You've all read The Hobbit, right? One of the things that boosted tourism in New Zealand was after the Hobbit films came out and people wanted to go visit Hobbiton. And they've actually created hotels. I mean, usually a movie, when they strike, they tear down these things, but people are still visiting Hobbiton. The forest in Harry Potter, these forests have become so visited that they've had to kind of turn away people, that people want to visit these places. So like these landscapes of film that have these sacred mystical elements now become places that people want to make pilgrimages to. Now, one of Liz and I's last trip to England, we were on our way to Scotland. We were at King's Cross Station. We were going to get on our train. We hadn't gotten our tickets, and there was a line all the way outside the door. We went, oh, Jesus Christ, we'll never get on the train. So we get into the station. We realize, oh, this is the station where Harry Potter left. And what they had to do, because so many people were trying to find platform 9 3/4, they actually built a 9 3/4. So people for hours will stand in line to get their picture taken to go on the platform 9 3/4, even though that's not 9 3/4, it's not on the train station. So it's kind of this idea of creating things. And we took this, so many people were endangering their lives to get a photograph of the Harry Potter train as it curves around this viaduct, that they had to make a special fenced off area for people to safely take photographs of when the Harry Potter train comes around the corner. So it's interesting how these transposed magical, mystical things in the film, we want them so much that we want to become part of them. Now, what if Harry Potter and his fellow wizards were landscape architects? What would the world look like? I think this is an important thing to think about. Landscape architecture is magic. You know, like, how do we transform that magical element into landscape? While Liz and I were teaching this class in sacred landscapes, we began to think about this idea of, like, how can you divine design? You know, like, how can we reactivate these kind of sacred elements in the landscape and make them part of our design vocabulary? So we went back to something that happened to us when we were in Rome, and the Temple of Hercules was always been off limits. And we were staying at the Academy, and we were able to go on a tour by one of the archaeologists that took us to this shrine. And we went in there, and we're walking around. We actually got to climb on the scaffolding. And right before we were climbing up to the roof, the leader said, "Watch your head," in Italian. And Liz was happy. Oh, I can understand it in Italian. Just as she hit her head on the bulkhead, she had to climb down, almost knocked herself out. She's sitting on the bench, trying to gather her wits about her. She looks down, and right to her right-hand side is the oracle, the Italian oracle deck of cards. This makes it even more interesting in that this really is not the temple to Hercules, it's the temple to the goddess of fortune, that this is really the fortune. And this is where we began to look at the idea of, like, maybe what we could do is create a, you know, like, how do we create this vocabulary of sacred landscapes? So in this class, what I tried to do is have my students, with my lectures, I created this grid with these four kind of panels, and I said, so I want you to synthesize what I'm talking about in my Sacred Landscapes lecture and turn it into like a visual icon and create a text. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, holy cow, these look like tarot cards. So I said to the class, would you all like to make a set of tarot cards? So we did. So we created this idea of the tarot cards. And in looking at this, I had to study tarot cards. I mean, supposedly the origins go back to Egypt. And they were transferred. Where do you think gypsies come from? The word gypsies comes from Egypt, because they took this hidden knowledge from Egypt, this magical knowledge, and spread it throughout Europe through the reading of fortune cards and the creation of the decks of tarots. So each one of my students did like four tarot cards. We put these together into a deck of tarot cards that kind of catalog these sacred landscapes of landscape into a kind of personal identification. And then how do you turn this into design? So as a way of divining design, we came up with this idea of the medicine wheel spread. Each student had to come up with a description of their card and the sacred meaning and how it could be applied to landscape design. So we would read the student's card, they would shuffle the cards, we do the medicine wheel spread. First card is the genus loci, the second card is the call to adventure, the third call is crossing the threshold, the fourth is the trials and tribulations, and fifth is resolution. So we use these as a way of creating design. And the designs that my students came up with, not only were they based on these sacred elements in landscape architecture, but they were really amazing designs. They really were something that we had never seen before. So I was really excited about this idea of a way of breaking through a creative tool, not only creatively, but something that connect us to the sacred elements that we use in our design with. Thank goodness one of my students actually knew how to read cards, and this is like our final kind of critique was everybody got their cards read, and we put the designs on the wall. And this is another really interesting kind of resolution that was derived from the reading of tarot cards. So this was something they had to do. So each one of the four cards that they did, they would put it on their medicine wheel spread so we could kind of look at the elements that they were using in their design. And this was my student, Hannah Pei. This is one of her designs. So the designs were amazingly rich and innovative. So Liz and I were talking about what we were doing to the director of education at the ASLA when we were in Washington, D.C. We were telling her, she said, what are you doing? What are you guys doing? So we've been doing these tarot cards. And she said, you know what? At the next ASLA convention, I'd like you to submit a proposal to do a workshop on divining design with tarot cards. And we said, oh, sure, we'll do that. So when the applications, months later, when the applications were due, we wrote her and said, now, are you sure? And she goes, yes, absolutely. We never thought we'd get accepted, and we did. This indicates that the ASLA is kind of now in the age of Aquarius. We planned for 15 to 20 people. And when, and when we got there, there were over 200 people. 200 people showed up. They had to turn people away at the door. I think this is really interesting new beginnings of landscape architecture. With the embarking, it's kind of stunning how many people are into tarot cards. So I think we're on the verge of a new, like reclaiming our mythological history, our mythological devices. So when COVID hit and we were quarantined, Liz and I decided to do something where we would create a book of days for the month of May. And what we found out, this is based on pagan kind of celebrations in each one of the days. When you get into this, almost every day of our calendar has some sort of pagan, ecological, mythological kind of celebration. So what we would do is, like, I started off and then Liz would respond to that. So like we would every day we did a different card, and we created this kind of like wonderful board of cards where I would do pen and ink drawings and Liz would do her magnificent collages. And I think this is a really great way of kind of illuminating that every day that you get up, that there's some sort of sacred connection to the beginning of time. What's going on in that day? So that's how we kind of spent our, our quarantine. So the last thing I want to sum up with is this idea of the metaphysics of drawing. Drawing is a portal into another dimension. And I can't think of two people, Beatrice and James, that promote this idea of drawing as a metaphysical element. I mean, when they were most passionate about this with their students, and you should both look up their work that they're doing contemporary, like they're just doing some fabulous stuff. So when I was in school, two of the books that influenced me were really influenced me were Carlos Castaneda's Teachings of Don Juan. And both of these books are important because what they did is they taught me how to see the landscape. They were a way of looking at the landscape. And it was also about this kind of like Indian mentor, is in college, I spent 3 months in the desert back to Florida, working in Coral Gables, Florida. A year went by, and I began to forget about this venture. And then one day, I was really mad in the office, and I walked down Calle Ocho, and I was walking down this street, and I passed an abandoned bookstore, what I thought was an abandoned bookstore. I walked in, and my eyes adjusted, and this little man came around the corner. He handed me a book, and he says, I want you to read this, and when you're done, come back and we'll talk about it. The irony of this, I spent 3 months in the desert trying to find a wise man to teach me this information, and right in the worst place in the US, in Florida, in Miami, I found a mentor. And this has been transformed into cartooning the landscape. Is sort of like a kind of tribute. It's my kind of opus, and it talks about this kind of young man, searching for knowledge and finding this bookstore. I turned it into a comic book store, and the whole idea is there's six books within Cartooning the Landscape, and each book, after he reads each comic, he returns to the comic book store and talks to the mentor, and they have these discussions. And so that's what Cartooning the Landscape kind of talks about, these discussions I had with my mentor about drawing, about consciousnness, about seeing things. I mean, it was like the big portal in my life. And each one of these 6 books in Cartooning the Landscape sort of has these kind of like different focal points that we talk about in the design. And the other thing that I think is important to think about, all of you that are in the design fields, that the design process is the alchemical process. You start from chaos and you move to gold. You move to illumination. I mean, there's the base part of alchemy where you're just trying to make gold out of lead, but there's also spiritual alchemy, that the design process is a spiritual quest, that you're moving through these different processes as you become more and more refined, and you find consciousness through drawing and through this element of enlightenment when it finally all comes together. You all know when you've been working late at night, right? And something becomes together, and all of a sudden 10 hours have gone by. Where did that time go? You were in the zone. You were in the kind of like the alchemical process. You were into the spiritual transformation of the design process and moving into another dimension. And in summary, I think it's important not to forget that design is magic, but it's not magic. It is magic. It's kind of this process of moving back and forth. The muse only comes when you work your ass off, and it also when you give up hope. It's kind of like that Zen element of working really, really hard and giving up hope, and then suddenly enlightenment happens. So I think that's important to figure. We always get to these points, these plateaus where things aren't moving forward, and that's when you kind of give up hope, and that's when enlightenment begins to happen. So in summary, I just wanted to finish. Today in America is Veterans Day, and this is my father and me and my mother right before my dad went off to the Korean War. My dad fought in 3 wars, actually 4, he was a hero, and I think this was the greatest generation, and I'm sure in England, your Veterans Day is also right around the corner, that we have the ability, the privilege to be able to do these exercises and study sacred landscapes, or those that gave their lives and risked their lives to make the world a safer place. So we might kind of go off on these different follies and find our dreams and search for knowledge. I mean, these people made the world a safer place, so we would be allowed to kind of find our own kind of opportunities. So in summary, I thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. I only wish that James and B and Mark, we could all get together and go to a pub and have some nice drinks, and have us all together. Maybe someday I'll be back in England and we can all meet up in the pub and have some Guinnesses and cigars. So I think that's the end of my little spiel. Thank you very much, and go out there and create this kind of global mythology that will make the world this sort of personification of the genus loci. So may the genus loci always be with you. Thank you. Now I can have a cup of coffee.
Well, thank you so much, Chip. Just imagine that everyone is clapping. So a virtual clap.
Metaphysically.
A virtual clap from across the globe, you know, from the other side of the pond. Thank you so much. I truly miss your lectures, and I do remember them fondly. I'm going to open the chat so for questions. So please do put your questions. I'll turn the chat on as well, just to see if you prefer to write, but just initiate any conversation you want.
So how do I see the chats? Am I going to see the chats, or will you tell them to me?
I can see if you don't want to yeah, Andrew was
I'm just
clapping.
trying to figure where do I. Oh yeah, I forgot to put up my last slide. Huh. If you want to see my website, it's Chip Sullivan, the original landscape cartoonist, or look at my work on Gonzo Gardens, or get in touch with me at csully@berkeley.edu.
So do we have any questions
Where do I
for
get to
Chip?
see the chats?
Hi, B. Dawn here.
Hi, Dawn.
If you don't mind.
Chip, Dawn is a colleague from the landscape. What do you call the landscape department? So she's in the landscape architecture program at BCU.
Hi, Chip.
Hi,
So
how are you?
thanks, I'm good. And much better after that lecture than I was before. I feel inspired. So I just have a question, and I think it responds to discussion that we're having in studio at the minute around contemporary landscape practice. And I suppose, how do we start to embed this genius loci? And these, I suppose you showed us lots of examples of revered landscapes, of historic landscapes, of things that have been preserved for a reason. So in contemporary landscape practice, do you think that we are doing enough to create the kind of landscapes that will stand the test of time and will have that legacy that you were talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it's really, really important. I think there's a couple ways of achieving that. I mean, I think one of the landscape architects we admire a lot in America is Lawrence Halprin, and before he worked on Sea Ranch, he kind of camped out on Sea Ranch for a month. I know we can't all do that, but I think, you know, like in addition to all these great electronic tools, I think the more we can kind of get a sense of the site, to let the site speak to us. One of the things that I've, you know, like in kind of putting this lecture together, or landscapes to think about, is that, you know, like sacred landscapes aren't, you know, those beautiful things, you know, those preserved places, you know, the waterfalls in Tivoli, or, you know, the stones, the cairns in Brittany. But sacred spaces, you know, genus loci exist in everywhere. I mean, how many of you have been in a haunted house, or, you know, like, or you've walked in an urban space and felt something? So I think that genus loci is everywhere. And I think one of our responsibilities is to try to find it. I also think too, like if we design meaningful landscapes, I think the genus loci, like the creative muse, will come to that space. So in some sense, it's kind of like, how do we set that up? How do we set that sacred? How do we create a kind of corral or an opportunity for those things to happen? And I just want to, you know, reiterate that it's not just these beautiful natural preserved landscapes that have sacred spaces. I mean, you can feel it in the subway, or the tube, as you call it, right? You know, like you can feel it in why are haunted houses, and also, like, you know, maybe it's good to take a child with you, because somehow children are afraid of houses, or they're afraid of things. So in some sense, it's kind of like attuning ourselves to those hidden things, you know, like, and then setting up a receptor that can capture it and integrate it into it. So I think that might be maybe a way forward, I think.
Yeah, and if you had any advice for our students, I suppose, about something they can do to try to capture and to recognize those intangible qualities on their sites and in the places they're designing, is there anything any wisdom you can impart?
You know, it's kind of mystic, that you go to the site and you let everything go from your mind, and you kind of attune yourself to what's happening on the site. You know, it takes an effort, it takes some time. You know, you have to sit and rest and be part of the site. Even if there's people moving through the site, they're kind of like the hidden flows of nature. So I would say the key is opening yourself up. You know, like we all have, in some ways, you know, like the chakras. You know, you line up all those chakras and you allow the third eye to open and you allow things to absorb. There's also the element of learning to see that comes out in Carlos Castaneda's work, which is kind of like you'll stare at something, and if you can shift your eyes really slowly, you can kind of see in between things. So it's kind of like this ability of opening yourself up to the vibrations. I mean, because I'm a child of the 60s, we always talked about it's the vibe, man. You know, so it's kind of like everything has a vibration. People have vibrations. I mean, there are people you meet, you like right away. There are people that kind of like, well, I don't know. So, you know, like space has a vibration. So I think it's kind of attuning yourself to these vibrations and drawing it in. That would be helpful.
Great.
I think.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks.
Thanks, Dawn. We have some notes on the textbooks. We have from Robin says, jazz hands with spirit fingers in gratitude. And we have a question from Widuri, which I'm going to read. So she asks, where do you feel spirituality comes from? Do you feel that a sense of spirituality is a constructive man, or is there an overarching divinity that man can only replicate and enhance rather than construct wholly on our own?
That's a good question. I feel like, I mean, I'm sort of a transcendentalist. I think as landscape architects, you kind of have to be. I think that there's a living spirit in everything, you know, that everything is alive. It's one of the things I like about the Chinese concept of qi, that even a rock has a spirit. So I kind of believe that everything has this living spirit, you know, and maybe humans are just a conduit to that. You know, I mean, part of that is kind of like we're maybe personifying that, which is why the Greeks and the Romans gave divinity, you know, gave human characteristics to these different qualities in a landscape. But I think without us, all of these elements have this sort of like innate kind of transcendental, that, you know, it's like, you know, without being too theological, that God is in everything, you know, and that part of us is tapping, and part of us as designers is to tap into that. And so I think that's kind of like the concept that I believe, you know, that this would, we're just here, you know, these things exist without us. I think it's important for us as designers to be able to channel that, or make people aware of that it's everything. And, you know, I mean, you just look at the popularity of the Harry Potter films and the, you know, the Hunger Games, is that there is this innate desire for magic. And I think the magic is there. If we open our hearts, we can find that magic in everything. And there's philosophers that talk about the beauty in everyday life, pouring yourself a coffee, or going to a coffee shop in London and watching someone that really does their job well, or make you that cappuccino. That's beauty, and that's art, and that's kind of tapping into the cosmos. Does that help?
Awesome. We do have two more questions, one from Lucas and another one from Sandra. Two also landscape architect tutors. I'm going to ask Lucas. Lucas, would you like to ask the question?
B, I think Lucas's children are in the background. So
oh, okay. So I'll just hopefully he's listening. So I'll just read his question. Says, I find the question of art versus science a tired argument in our profession, but still some people try to dismiss narrative approaches. I wonder, have you experienced this, and what is your response?
I mean, to me, I mean, these are three areas that I'm really interested in integrating, you know, like art and science. And I think that there was a time during the Enlightenment when art was science. And I think, I really think that science can be artful. And I think that, you know, like part of our jobs as designers is to kind of integrate all three of those together. You know, I think, you know, and it's kind of like searching for the golden section. if you try to design with the golden section, you'll probably mess up. You'll probably kind of not create a good design. But if you do a good design that feels good, and it does all the things I've been talking about, I bet you could find the golden section in there. So it's kind of like the process of creativity, where you take all these inputs, you read everything about science, you read everything about ecology and art, and you kind of put those things inside, and then you let your mind go and see how they come out and they come together. I think all these things are really, really important. There was a really good book out not long ago that I really loved. It was called Art and Physics. And it was really advancements in science kind of parallel, and all of these other things kind of like are happening in a parallel kind of conduit, not knowing what the other ones are doing. So I think it's really important to kind of integrate all those things that you were talking about. Does that help?
Good. So I'm not sure if Sandra wants to ask her question. Would you like me to read?
Please, sorry,
Okay. More children in the back. Okay. So Sandra, she asks, thank you for your very inspiring lecture. I too was introduced to the Genius Loci in the very beginning of studying landscape architecture, as well as to your drawing the landscape. Do you think modern users of landscapes have lost most of the connection to the transcendental and mythical qualities of nature and natural processes? Or are we, users, perhaps reinterpreted them? Or are we more observers standing apart, taking selfies?
Yeah, I think all three of those are right. I think one of the things I am afraid that we've moved further away from the idea of the genus loci, but at the same time, I think with all these wonderful tools, if we move them together, I think the genus loci is absolutely the foundation of landscape architecture and site design. But how do we, I think the next step, and that's kind of where I came from, like these last years, like after reading Codify, how do we integrate both of these? Like we use the genus loci as the foundation, and then we can use remote sensing, like these global tools that we have with other offices to kind of integrate those things. I mean, I don't think it should be thrown away. I think it should be integrated. And I do think that it can be integrated. But I am worried about selfies. I am worried about the cell phone as a way of kind of further removing us. But I think that, like I have my students, when we're drawing site plans, use their cell phone to see the plan view, the GP, like the aerial view of the site. So I think I'm a believer in balance, everything in moderation. And I believe in building a foundation and integrating that into your design work, and then kind of trying to figure out how can we use these great new tools, but to kind of expound the kind of genus loci and the sacred elements. How can we now have a global audience. We have the opportunity with all these great electronic tools and working internationally to kind of create a global mythology and see that all of our mythological histories are the same. This could be something to unite the world. If you think about it, the genus loci could be this great, like unifier. I mean, it's really about, it's the basis of climate change. Like it's, how do we, like if we understand the genus loci, we wouldn't be screwing up the atmosphere. So I really hope and believe that, and your job is to, because I'm too far gone, into the past, really understand what all these electronic tools are. It's your job, to go back to the genus loci, not let that go, use it, and kind of create this moderation of technology to create these, to bring out this kind of global mythology, like for our future.
So inspiring. We have a note from Maya. Thank you so much for that, Chip. And thank you so much to the university for allowing this to be part of our academic journey. I'm also interested to know here your opinion about the Earthship biotecture movement.
It's absolutely necessary. I mean, we look at the Earth ship, think about that. You know, if you look at the universe, you know, you look at our universe, like the Earth is this green, blue, atmospheric kind of thing that's alive. You know, if you look at it, maybe the Earth is alive. You know, maybe that's, you know, we're just kind of like on it. So, I mean, I really think that thinking of the biosphere, I think is important, because one of the things I learned from Howard Odom's book is this kind of interconnectedness of everything. You know, that it's like, so if you look at the Earth ship, I mean, when you're on a ship, you need all of your supplies. So you're kind of like, I think it's a really great way of looking into sustainability and how do we create that sustainability. You know, like if we look at it as sort of like a combined unit and we're on this ship, you know, blasting through the cosmos, you know, like we better make sure we have enough food and water, you know, like it's kind of a sustainable thing. So I think that's a worthy kind of ideal to kind of look at.
Just want to tell that Widgery says, amazing answer, thank you. We do have a question from Tracy that says, hi, sorry, I missed what the book you mentioned was as the screen froze. I don't know how much back does this go, so I'm not sure exactly which book she's now referring to, but maybe Tracy, just drop a note so we can just kind of situate when was this, because I'm just reading in order the messages.
I think it might be, you know, maybe it was the books by Carlos Castaneda, The Teachings of Don Juan.
Could have been.
The Indian medicine man, that was one. And then the other book I talked about was Cartooning Landscape.
So you can check, Tracy.
Yeah,
and
you also, you recorded the lectures, so she could probably
yes,
go
exactly. It's been recorded
that way. If not,
yes.
if not, those were the two books that I talked about. But, you know, sometimes I go off on spontaneous prose. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about sometimes, so I might have mentioned a book.
Just a reply from Lucas that says, thanks, Chip. Totally agree that it's integrated, inseparable, and distinctly human, a social science and more. Okay, that's it for the chat. Do we have some students participation?
If there's no questions, Bea, I just want to say thank you, Chip, for preparing a really inspiring lecture. It's a lovely, inspiring and nostalgic feeling that I get watching it again. I just wanted to ask you, for the students listening, can you talk about the lessons that you've learned from the drawing process and maybe drawing activities that they could do daily when they wake up? Well,
yeah, I mean, the number one greatest thing to do when you wake up in the morning is draw your coffee cup. If you don't, I guess you're English and you'll probably be drinking tea. Will probably be some, you know, a Guinness. But I mean, I always start off kind of drawing what's ever around me. The first thing I do when I go to my studio, the other thing that gets me going is, you know, I have a little sketchbook, and in the back of it, I'll write my dreams down. You know, I'll diagram my dreams. So I think those are two things. I think it's important to always keep a sketchbook with you, you know, and be drawing all the time. And I found, like, when I first went to Rome and I was a Rome fellow, so overwhelmed by the art and the beauty of Rome, I couldn't work. So I just started to draw the things that are on my drawing top, you know, as a really great thing. And, you know, I wanted to mention too, like, you know, like those speeded up drawings you did when you were in Rome, are those on your website? You should have your students take a look at those. Those are really, really beautiful drawings.
Thanks. I still have them on the website, yeah.
And I like that whole thing of how you recorded your drawings, and you know, also drawing on dark paper with a white Prismacolor. That was really neat stuff.
The blueprints, yeah.
Yeah, those are great. So, I mean, I think, like, you know, like my advice is get a nice fountain pen that you like, and keep a sketchbook with you at all times. You know, when we get back in the classroom, draw the lecture. Visual note taking is a really big thing now. You know, instead of writing notes, draw the slides, draw the images. That's a really great way of practicing and a really great way of recording your things. And sometimes, you know, like when I'm waiting for a cup of coffee, you know, and you're at the coffee shop, draw the people that are in line waiting for coffee. You know, like if you're on the bus, draw the people in front of you. You know, draw all the time. And you'll create this amazing vocabulary of images.
That's the best advice. We have one note from Andy. Incredible stuff, hearing stories about magical and mystical places and the journey to find them in something I only experienced late in life, and appreciate this even more now I've experienced it.
Maybe I actually have a follow-up question to that.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent. First of all, thank you so much. That was incredible, Chip.
Thanks.
The drawing exercise of turning all those ideas into tarot cards and using them as part of the creative process was fascinating. And I'm not sure where or how I can incorporate this, but the very idea of it reminds me of a game that I used to play where you would have different prompts and eras you had to get to a certain end. And between each player, you create stops and you create these different experiences as you go through that, through different cards that you put down. So I thought that was really, really fascinating and a different approach, which I didn't expect to find. So thanks so much for that.
Yeah, and I would think, one of the things you could do is you could start to, pre-print little cards and start to record on those cards elements in the landscape that you find really emotional or moving, and then, use those as prompts, shuffle them up and deal out 5 and see where that leads you. Like you can begin to create your own sort of prompt cards, which is something Liz and I were trying to do with we're in the process of writing a book on using the tarot deck, as a key to, like evoking these sacred concepts in the landscape, but, kind of struggling right now with how to kind of get that out there. But one of the things we want to put in the book is how to make your own tarot cards or own prompt cards. So that's something to think about.
Really awesome. Let us know how that turns out. We'd love to know more.
Hopefully soon. Thanks.
Yeah. The idea of being in nature was always seen as like an escape from the urban. Like it's a different kind of shrouded experience that you want to seek instead of being like in the claustrophobia of the city. That's something that I've experienced, and it's hard to get the same genus loci or the spirit of the city in the same mystical way as being in a forest. Is that like can we achieve a similar kind of mysticism or magic being in the city as we would being in forests?
I really think so. I mean, you look at cities were once forest, they have this kind of like time machine history. And I do think, this is a question I've been thinking about because, like everything that I've been presenting is about nature and nature spaces, but I think cities have spirits of place. I mean, you've walked, you've felt it, and oftentimes even in nature is not totally benevolent. Nature, if you've ever been alone in the woods and gotten lost, that's the haunted forest. There's also haunted forest. So nature can play tricks on you. You've been in the city and the hair on the back of your neck has stood up. What is that? You've walked around a corner. So I really do think that, it's a way of, I'm beginning to think about like, how can we use this in the urban sense? And I've talked about haunted houses, but I've talked about, you've gone into places that make you feel good, right? You've gone into places that make you feel bad. There's places you've been apprehensive, in some ways, learning to take, what do you call it? Like perception, not for granted, but to really believe in what we're feeling. Like don't turn around that corner, or maybe I better stop at this green light. And then just as you're about ready to go through the green light, a car drives, runs the red light. So it's kind of like these perceptual tools, I think, really have their place in urban settings. And because most of our work is urban, I think it's a way of learning, especially in London or other cities, there are probably battles there, it's kind of like people have died, there have been celebrations, like those things that layering of history is there under the ground, it's there. So like, it's how do we open up the tubes and learn how to absorb that?
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Chip, we have a note from Tracy as well. She says, thank you. This was such a wonderful talk. I practiced Reiki and found this inspiring, enabling the integration of design and spirituality. Very inspiring and evoking.
Thank you.
So is there any more questions?
May I ask a question, please, Beatrice?
Of course, Robin.
Thank you.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, Chip. I'm Robin. I graduated in the pandemic for interior architecture and design. And my final major project was on vertical farming. And I wish I had had your lecture this time last year so that I could use the nymphomania, the nymphs and how they use water, because I really find that the connection between vertical farming and saving water and sustainability to be quite interesting. And I wanted to know if you had any tips on how to use a genus loci for professional practice in interiors, because obviously we're not outside so much. And any advice you could give me to develop that sensory reading into a professional solution would be really wonderful, please.
Well, you're doing something that's really important, you know, this interior vertical gardens. So in some sense, part of what you're doing is you're creating the genus loci. You know, like, you know, if you think about it, the genus loci didn't exist, you know, and I'm specifically talking about, you know, the Romans and the Greeks until they named it. You know, it wasn't there. So what you're creating is something really, really important. These interior vertical gardens, I mean, not only they're purifying the air, they can be used to kind of cleanse brown water, gray water, you know, like you're adding humidity to the air, you're kind of creating a purified, you know, interior. So like this is the spirit of the place. You're actually the creator, you're the namer and the giver. And I think what you're doing is really, really important. And what an exciting career to have, you know? I mean, I've watched these vertical gardens and green roofs and stuff and rain gardens, kind of like just the time is now. You're at the perfect point. And it's a great time to integrate these kind of spiritual things into these spaces, you know, either by naming them or, you know, like having kind of like all these electronic things that are available to you, they're educating people about what this vertical garden is. It's also even within that using some of the, you know, like what's interesting too, every plant on the planet has some god or goddess associated with that plant. So if you think about it in the choice of the plant material you're using, you know, you're activating one of the plants from these sort of genus loci manifestations. So that's also an option. You know, like these vertical gardens can have flowers. The rose, for instance, has innumerable associations cross-culturally. You know, so things like that. So what you're doing is bringing the world of plant mythology into these vertical gardens. And I just thought of that. That's really cool. Oh, that's good for you. Wow, how exciting.
Thank you. I wanted to bring the outside in and the inside out a little bit literally. And I managed to read a really good book called The Hungry City by Dr. Caroline Steele. She really informed a lot of what I was thinking, although it was mainly more focused on architecture. And I really appreciate that you shared some books with us. And I wanted to share that one with you to say thank you.
Thanks. I'll get
You're
it.
welcome. Yeah, The Hungry City by Dr. Caroline Steele, S-T-E-E-L, like the material.
Got it written here. Thanks.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. And
You're
good
welcome,
to see you.
Beatrice. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's giving me a lot of life through the lockdown.
Yeah, make your book of days.
Is there any more questions? If I don't, I have one of my own and to connect. So you know, Chip, marvelous, awe-inspiring and provocative as usual, and it's, you know, it does make me go back, you know, a decade ago and into the halls of Huster to hear you talking. So one thing that you know, there's sort of kind of this still segregation between you know, the different courses, like interiors, like landscape, like architecture. So I think what I would like to ask you is what sort of conversation do you see fundamental for architects and landscape architects and you know, all creators of space, be that, you know, more material, more organic? What sort of conversation do you advise, you know, young students to have?
Well, I think it's really important that these things get integrated. I mean, we used to have in Worcester Hall, we used to teach a class in site planning that all of the professions had to take. I think if you kind of develop some sort of base, you know, where everybody can kind of talk about these things, you know, because, you know, like, it's kind of like landscape architects, we want to preserve the landscape. Architects want to make the landscape. Interior designers want to create, you know, harmonious interior spaces. And I think that how do we integrate? It's a good question. We need to integrate these things. And perhaps, you know, at your school, when COVID is over, if you could have kind of like, you know, group sessions where you get together and talk about these ideas, or just get everybody together and kind of like talk about the genus loci. Do a project together where you're actually kind of creating the genus loci. That might be a way to do it. But I mean, we need to I mean, it's again, you know, like all of these, it's the division of art and science. When art and science separated and all the kind of categories broken up, we become kind of specialists. And what we really need now is someone to unify, like a Da Vincian, a Miss Da Vinci, you know, to pull all these together, you know, and kind of like make us work as a unit. And not, what do they call it, silos? You know, we're creating these silos where we can't get together. De-silo.
Absolutely. Do we have any more questions for Chip? We have a note from Chantel that says, "Thank you for a very inspiring lecture."
Thank you.
You know, there's many notes from guests. So I think if there's no more questions, we here in the GMT time probably are going to get some supper whilst whilst Chip is about to start his day.
Yeah, time for me to have my second cup of coffee. And I just wish I was in London or England so we could go to the pub and have a Guinness together, but we'll put that off to my next trip. I can't wait to get back to Scotland and London and see Mark and Bea, and we can have a big party. So let's put that on hold.
Absolutely.
And, we'll have a
Absolutely. Would love to.
Party.
Absolutely. That's a plan. Just need the madness to kind of you know, get done with this and just get back to normal. So you can come and visit us.
That would be amazing, Chip.
I'm on it. Next safe flight out.
Chip, I wanted to thank you deeply for your kind contribution and your awe-inspiring, provocative, amazing, and marvelous insight and talk, showing us your drawings and your journeys. I'm very grateful for you to share with all the students here and everyone that will see your lecture on YouTube as well. Thank you so much. And I do miss teaching drawing with you.
I miss you, but the torch has been passed. The passion is there. Mark, you guys do it. You know, that's the great thing about teaching, is that, you know, like the student is now the teacher. You're passing the torch, and it's, you know, like I feel like the world is in good hands.
Great mentor. Thank you so much, Chip. Thanks everyone for zooming in.
Okay.
Make sure you keep safe. And thank you so much again, Chip.
Well, thank you. And I'll see you all on the flip side. Thanks everybody for your wonderful comments. I really appreciate it. This was really fun. And I guess this is the future. The future is here today. And Gina Slow sign out.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.